Welcome to Libero, the podcast about the most important of the least important things, as Freddie Shepherd once said. My name is Jack Pitt-Brooke, I'm from The Athletic. I'm joined today by Rory Smith from The Observer and Jonathan Wilson. Now, before I say hello to them, I'd like to say hello to you, the listener and the viewer. Thank you for all your support so far, and I just wanted to ask if you have the time to rate or review us on Spotify or Apple, or if you're watching on YouTube, if you could just smash those like and subscribe buttons, that would be very much appreciated by everybody here at Libero Towers. Now, Rory and Jonathan, you were both at Anfield on Friday. How were you sat together, Rory?
We weren't. Wilson was one row in front of me because he is more important.
But I was able to point out to you the apparent offender in the Semenyo incident.
We now have to be very careful, don't we?
Very quickly.
You did. It was like watching Wilson, one of the game's preeminent historians, suddenly develop a news itch. And when there were three police officers pointing at, there was three police people and a club official pointing at the fan who was accused, allegedly racially abused Antoine Semenyo. I think we have to say it was Wilson who saw what was going on, saw what was unfurling like a dog with a bone.
Yeah. Look at the lowercase g in the Google ad, I was shouting.
That's right, yeah. It was a slightly weird way to position where the person was. But no, we watched it unfold together, and I think this will sound very, very like, if Midell was on, he'd be very, very scornful of this. I think that game produced one of the most what is likely to be one of the most moving and powerful images of the season, which is Salah crying on the pitch at full time. I think that is I don't know whether it's because people are still uncomfortable talking about Jota's death. I think we don't kind of talk about death very well as a country. Or whether it's because so much other stuff happened in that game and then you had an entire Premier League weekend after it. I think it's been maybe lost a little bit, but for a player of that level to showcase that level of emotion and that amount of grief in public, I think has a kind of resonance beyond football, to be honest.
Yeah, I found all the stuff before the game incredibly moving. The stuff with Salah at the end, actually way more moving. It wasn't a sort of institutional representation of grief. It was somebody clearly, personally, really hurting, and I think you saw how touched he was by the fans' reaction. So that I think was astonishingly moving. But I mean, the whole evening, there's so much happened. I mean, the game was an incredible game. Also, that we sort of were joking there about sort of pointing out the Semenyo incident, but they really horrible, serious, unpleasant incident, and I sort of got the sense that it had been handled pretty well. And Semenyo came out and sort of said that, and it's one of those things where as a white bloke sitting 50 yards away, you don't really want to judge it or judge how people are behaving, but it did appear that there was sort of widespread sympathy. I thought there's a moment when Anthony Taylor, the referee, put his hand on Semenyo's shoulder just before the game restarted, apparently saying sort of, are you okay? And I found that quite a touching moment. And then it's really noticeable at the final whistle that Arne Slot went over and had, I'd say, quite a long chat, 20 or 30 second chat with Semenyo, who appeared to be saying, something along the lines of, well played, you're brilliant, and, are you okay? So I sort of, it was astonishing way to start the season. I mean, I was at Manchester United against Fulham the opening day the previous season when the only thing to write about was, is Joshua Zirkzee maybe okay? Whereas last Friday, so much going on, really hard to work out what the key line was, work out what you're going to write about. Just sort of this huge sort of explosion of Premier League storylines and excitement and interest and sadness and disgrace and as Rory says, probably in the end, the image it stays with you is Salah wiping away the tears with his cough.
Wilson, you were then at Old Trafford, weren't you, on Sunday for a game which I found very funny, having not attended. I did the radio on Monday night, and we did like a full hour on Manchester United 0, Arsenal 1, which I've got to admit at points felt like maybe too much. But it was good how Arsenal won, but that was bad, and United lost, but that was great, and I really liked that. Like for the post, I think, Jack, this is your phrase, isn't it? The post results reality, Where
No.
now it doesn't actually matter what the score was in the games. We're like, well, actually, if you look at the XG, they played better, so really they won. And it is when you're kind of in the thick of it, and you find yourself saying, oh yeah, look, United were brilliant, and Buemo isn't he exciting? Cunha, what a debut! And you think, hang on, they lost, and they lost without really creating any chances.
Yeah, I mean, I came away from that thinking, have I misjudged this? Because I didn't think United were particularly good. I didn't think Arsenal were particularly good either. United had chances, but it didn't seem to be much coherence there. It was just things suddenly happened. It was a pretty bitty, disjointed display. You saw the problems they got in midfield. You saw the problems they got at the back. You certainly saw the problems they've got in goal. And it's almost, I mean, I think this is what I might end up writing about this weekend, is United lose at home, and the reaction is, oh, they were okay actually. We're now in the pity phase of United's collapse.
Yeah, the sort of low expectations era. We could talk about football all day, but we're not actually here to talk about football today. We're here to talk about something much more interesting and much more important, which is the transfer market, which is really why I get out of bed every morning. I'm sure it's the case for you two as well, because we are now in the penultimate week of the transfer window. And the biggest unresolved story of the window is not only still going, but I think has actually ratcheted up another gear last night. And that is, of course, the story of Alexander Isak, who is still a Newcastle United player. Newcastle have, of course, rejected a £110 million bid from Liverpool earlier this month, but he has not played for Newcastle United yet. Either in pre-season, I think, or certainly during this season. He didn't play at Villa Park in the 0-0 draw, which opened Newcastle's season. And then late last night, on Tuesday, Isak finally took to Instagram, his Instagram story, which is Wilson's favourite form of social media, to issue a statement in which he referred to, he's clearly hinting at a broken gentleman's agreement between him and Newcastle United. He says he refers to things that were said and agreed behind closed doors. He said promises were made. He said promises were broken. Then, late last night, just as I was getting into bed, Newcastle United hit back with a statement of their own, insisting that no commitment has been made by a club official that Alex can leave Newcastle United this summer, and saying that and the Newcastle United statement effectively says, I mean, it implies that they were open to selling him, but they don't sound optimistic that will happen. I mean, optimistic is probably the wrong way of putting it, but they said, they don't think the conditions will be met. Rory, is this more? I mean, clearly it is more posturing from both sides, but how do you see it playing out from here? Do you think those conditions will be met in the last week and a half of the window?
Yeah, I think I've got to admit, first and foremost, I can't remember a transfer of this scale for a player of this profile playing out like this for ages. And I think the closest parallels, do you remember when Rooney tried to leave Man United for a bit? And
which one? There was the 2010 one to Manchester City, and there was
the
2013 one to Chelsea.
I believe I'm referring to 2010. And there was a real kind of that a lot of that was played out in public, but even then, I'm not sure United put out statements. I don't think there was it was this level of he said, she said between player and current club. Coutinho, there was a little bit of it when he left Liverpool. I think Liverpool ended up putting out a statement, and I think Coutinho then left in the following January. It is a genuinely extraordinary thing. One other little note that I think has been overlooked. It's really odd how Liverpool's first bid, or currently only bid for Isak, I think there will be a second one, is being described as though they kind of offered 40 million plus £1. They offered more money than a British club has ever paid for a footballer. Like that, in whatever you think of Isak's value, that's a serious opening bid. Liverpool were prepared to commit £110 million plus other stuff to signing him, and yet it's become kind of accepted that they put in this sort of laughable offer. You think, well, hang on, that would have made him the 7th most expensive player in history. It's a serious bid. It's not a joke. Anyway, I don't know how it plays out from here. I think, like you say, I read the statement from Newcastle, and it made it sound like they were open to selling him. People who cover Newcastle a bit more closely seem to have decided actually it said the exact opposite, and I'm not sure. I don't know how you read it like that, but they have read it like that. I think the crucial bit really, there's obviously been at best a breakdown in communications. Isak clearly thinks something was said to him that enabled him to think, I'm going to leave this summer, and Newcastle have obviously interpreted that in a different way. The fact that they said no club official, I think, is interesting, because that raises the spectre. Is it a former club official? Is it someone who is no longer at Newcastle? There's a couple of candidates there. Is it somebody from PIF? Is it somebody who is kind of in the power structure of the club but doesn't actually work for the club? That could do with clearing up, I think. Does it maybe that is the root of the problem? Newcastle saying we don't foresee the conditions being met. There are two kind of conditions, aren't there? One is the fee. Now, I'm sure Liverpool will, if they feel that there is a possibility of it working, will get closer to his valuation. It's a negotiation. You don't go in with your highest offer first. So I think that bit could still be met. Liverpool have now sold players for more than 200 million quid this summer. I think they have the headroom in PSR, and they certainly have the money available. The complicated bit is, can Newcastle get replacements in? And yeah, at this stage, that looks quite unlikely, to be honest. I think Wissa will get done eventually. That's like the mirror image of this story. It's just that it's happening at Brentford, so there's not kind of a load of people. There's not quite as many people who are frothing at the mouth about it. It's whether they can get a second in. I have views on whether they should be getting a second in if they're not particularly convinced by the player. But I think that looks unlikely. So my guess is you're going to end up with Isak staying, regardless of what Liverpool do. And that in itself presents like a million problems for how Newcastle reintegrate him, whether he wants to be reintegrated. You then have a player who clearly doesn't want to be there, who is kind of playing for the team, sort of. Like, how much is Alexander Isak going to try? I don't know. It's incredibly messy. And as things stand, he will be kept at Newcastle because they haven't been able to get deals done to replace him. And to be perfectly honest, of all the things in this saga, that bit really isn't Alexander Isak's fault. That's on Newcastle, that they've not got those deals done. I'm not sure that he will be happy to stay, especially if Liverpool put a second bid in. I'm not sure Alexander Isak will sit there and think, do you know what, this is okay. The club that I'm playing for could not sign a replacement for me despite trying to sign several. It's great that I get to be here. That doesn't seem like a recipe for success.
Before we come back to... I do want to get into all this stuff about gentlemen's agreements and Instagram story posts and Newcastle's own position. I do want to get into all of that later on, but I think I want to start with what has been, I think, the most emotive part of this for a lot of people, which is Isak being accused of being on strike. You know, clearly he hasn't been involved so far. He had a period of training by himself at Real Sociedad. Well, probably with other people at Real Sociedad, but certainly away from the Newcastle United group. He did not go to the family barbecue at Newcastle United. And, you know, of course, as Rory says, you know, this is not a unique situation. Johan Wissa at Brentford is currently in basically a sort of lower profile version of the same situation, right? Like, he hasn't been involved with Keith Andrews' team so far. But this really upsets people. Like, people get really legitimately angry and furious about this. You know, there were lots of "one greedy bastard" chants from Newcastle fans over the weekend. Jonathan, what's your view on this, and why do you think people get so upset about a player downing tools?
I think it's that word "strike" is such. I mean, particularly somewhere like Newcastle, which was enormously affected by the miners' strike. Strike still has a really emotive power. That there's a sense it's quite a serious business. You don't go on strike for on a whim. It's if you were in the mines or if you were in the shipyards and you went on strike, you were somebody who was a low paid worker who said, "I'm not even going to take that pay." You're really damaging your sort of social condition. You might not have enough food. You might not be able to clothe your children. You might not be able to turn the heating on. Your strike was a really serious business, and so for a player to go on strike when the issue of footballers' wages, we sort of, I think most people are quite good at comprehending it. That obviously, on one level, it is totally absurd that a man gets paid £140,000 a week for running about kicking a ball in a net. However, there is a lot of money in football. It's probably better it goes to the players and other people. And we can understand that Isak, on 140 grand a week, looks around the rest of the world and thinks, well, hang on, I'm better than him, and I'm better than him, and I'm better than him, and he's on 250, 280. Why can't I not have a bit more? And if he has been promised an improvement, which is what his statement last night said, then of course that sense of grievances is magnified. But I think it's that sense of somebody who is not really risking anything to go on strike. His family's not going to starve. He's not going to have to turn the heating off. It sort of feels like he's using the wrong weapon for this battle. I think that's why it's sort of so outrageous people.
Do you think strike is the wrong word?
I think it probably is from a legal and technical sense, because the whole series of conditions have to be met before you're legally allowed to go on strike, and I'm very certain those have not been met. On the other hand, as a simple sort of term for somebody not doing their job in order to make a protest, that kind of is what it is. So it's probably not legally or technically the right word, but I wouldn't sort of get massively upset by people using it, because it is an easy way of conveying what is going on.
Rory, where do you come down on this morally? Are you outraged by Isak not playing? Because there's no. We will get into both sides of this argument later, but there is no getting past the fact that lots of people are incredibly angry and upset about his conduct.
Yeah, and I think that's completely natural, because for fans, it strikes me as being one of those moments where you kind of peer behind the curtain. That to be a fan of any club, not just Newcastle, is to kind of fool yourself into thinking the players care as much about that club as you do. And that I think is the kind of natural condition of all fans. And when a player kind of plays every card in his hand, apart from one, there is still one that remains available to Isak, which we'll talk about later. It makes it very obvious like he not only does, to be honest, in this case, not only does Alexander Isak not care about Newcastle particularly, it was only ever like a business relationship to him. There's now a degree of like active hostility towards Newcastle. I think like he's clearly very annoyed, not necessarily with the institution of the club, but certainly with the hierarchy of the club. He feels he's been let down. He says the relationship is beyond repair, effectively, and the statement that he released made it sound an awful lot like he's not going back. And I think for fans that's hard to take, because it feels like a personal insult. This thing that you love is being used to an extent, I suppose, by the player, but also rejected by the player. And I think that the whole thing has been a really bad look for Alexander Isak. Alexander Isak has not come out of this well. There's no question about that. I think fans have every right to be furious with him. I think one greedy bastard, legitimate. You just have to suck that up effectively as a player. If he is reintegrated, he will be booed. That is right. But at the same time, I do have a bit of sympathy for him, because it feels deeply weird to me that Newcastle are basically saying, well, no, you might not want to be here, but we get to keep you. And I know he's under contract, but I think that's a relatively rare and fairly kind of unique phenomenon to sport. Maybe TV, like big executives in the entertainment industry, maybe big finance executives have the same thing. But generally, if you're like a hedge fund manager at, rapacious and greedy financial firm, like you're not expected to, and you want to leave, you're not expected to turn up for work. Like you put on gardening leave until you're not allowed to take the trade secrets or whatever. You're not expected to turn up for work, whereas Newcastle are basically asking, as what all football clubs do, they're asking Alexander Isak to kind of put his body on the line for an institution he wants to leave, and that feels weird to me. And I wrote about this the other day, like really conscious that players don't have that much power. There's not much Isak can do in this situation. So yeah, it's a really bad look, and it's hard to have any real sympathy with him for the reasons Jonathan says. But at the same time, what else is he meant to do to have any agency over his career? And before the accusations of hypocrisy come in, I kind of felt the same about Coutinho, to be honest, at Liverpool. I felt that he was playing he wanted to move to Barcelona, which was totally legitimate. That was his dream. Didn't work out. And he played the cards that he had, and it's a bad look for the player. But what else are they meant to do? Just sort of be like, all right, yeah, fine, okay, you can, yeah, you get to decide what I do with my life. That feels weird to me.
But I think this is, it's the point Rory made right at the start. I think is the key one, that a football club is a very complicated thing. It is, on the one hand, a business and subject to business law, and on the other hand, it's something else. And fans have this enormous emotional investment. And yeah, Rory's right. There's this sort of fiction that I guess we know is a fiction, that the players and the executives of that club have an equal bond. And some players, I think, do develop that. Some players you will be fans of a club they end up playing for. It doesn't necessarily mean that the sort of love endures. But fundamentally, the players are employees. You then have the executives who are looking to make money out of this business, out of this entity. And the fans' motivations are completely different. And so when one of those players says, actually, I don't want to be here anymore, I want to go get more money, have a better chance of winning things somewhere else, it feels like a betrayal. It feels like the love you are showing is not being reciprocated. I mean, why should it be? But that is part of the lie that all fans tell themselves. And sort of that is what fandom is sort of believing in that lie. And I think particularly, I mean, maybe I'm just speaking from my own experience here, but I think in the sort of big post-industrial provincial cities of the north, the football club is often, by an enormous margin, the one way for that city, for that town to represent itself on a national or global stage. And so it takes on this symbolic power way in excess of what is reasonable. And players benefit from that because that's one of the reasons why their wages are so high, why there's so much interest in it, why people want to watch this. But on the other hand, it means they've sort of signed up to a whole load of codes and faiths and they sort of become entangled in that emotional investment in a way that possibly they don't quite appreciate.
I think that's a really interesting and important point, because my instinctive view on this is to take quite what's ultimately an amoral view, which is that there's no morality in the transfer market, and that clearly clubs treat players clubs will treat players very disposably if they can afford to, and if it won't cost them money. And we see that every single transfer window. We can see that at the moment at Manchester United, where they've got a bomb squad, and then even separate from the bomb squad, they're trying to force out Rasmus Højlund, who's done nothing wrong and just wants to play for United, his employer. And so I think there's a big part of me that wants to say, well, look, there's no morality in the transfer market. The transfer market is simply a big food chain. Newcastle must accept their place in the food chain, and Isak must, Isak has the right to deploy the few cards that he has, as Rory says, as he sees fit. And I kind of think that up to a point, but I think it's also like hearing Jonathan talk just there about the symbolic importance of Newcastle to its fans, and obviously this is true of other fans and other fan bases and other cities as well. I think I don't know, you're kind of persuading me to this viewpoint that actually Isak should at the very least be more aware of the kind of emotional stakes that he's playing with. He's playing with other people's emotions, even if he is ultimately, even if from his point of view, he's playing with his own career.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, I think Newcastle maybe takes some of the blame here. Newcastle, the club, Newcastle, the sort of wider cultural force, in that I think they lost where they are in that food chain. I think the food chain is a really important thing to remember. That basically, unless you're Real Madrid, you are subject to predators. And you have to accept that. And the most successful Premier League clubs, or the most successful clubs, but let's keep it to the Premier League to sort of focus in a bit, because I know producer Tom loves to talk about Brighton's transfer policies. I know he thinks we don't discuss that anywhere near enough. But the clubs who've been most successful are those who accurately gauge where they are in that food chain, and they predate on those below them and are predated upon by those above them, and they make a profit in that act of predation, and that they then reinvest that, and they move up the food chain as a result. And I sort of think what happened with Newcastle was a sense, Mike Ashley's gone, brilliant, get the bunting out. Oh, incredibly rich people taken over. Oh, human rights, money, look at the money. We're now kind of one of the elite. We're the richest. We got the richest owners in the world. 75% of all the oil wealth in the world runs our football club. And I think there's an assumption of suddenly they were at the best seat on the top table. It's them and Florentino Perez and nobody else. And so when they get Isak, who, when they signed him, was a promising player with a fairly checkered record, didn't play well in Borussia Dortmund at all. But they've made him over 2 years into the most promising sort of mid-20s striker that there is. And so the sense of that is the level of player we should have at our club. The job now is to buy other players who are at that level, and then we can win the Champions League. And I know not all Newcastle fans sort of bought into it, but you remember the sort of videos of fans saying about Lionel Messi washing the dishes and Cristiano Ronaldo mowing the pitch and whatever. Because there's a sense of we have so much money, we can do anything. And for one reason or another, it hasn't turned out like that. And they're actually a bit lower in the food chain. And that idea of selling a player on, I think, it sort of feels like it sort of exposes the falseness of that self-image, but it also plays into insecurities that have been at the club for a long, long time. And again, maybe I'm particularly tuned to this because of growing up in the Northeast in the 80s. But in the 80s, you have to remember, Newcastle lost. Well, they produced and lost Peter Beardsley, Chris Waddle, Paul Gascoigne. 3 of the best attacking English players of the 80s and early 90s all came through at Newcastle. They were Newcastle players, and Newcastle had to sell them. And so that idea when John Hall took over of we are no longer a selling club was a very powerful statement. We are now breaking the world transfer record to sign Alan Shearer. We're bringing one of our own back. We're not losing our own. And I know Isak's not one of their own, but he arrives at 23. They develop him. He sort of feels slightly like one of their own. You see all the... what are we like? We're not allowed to say TIFO now, are we?
No, we are. It's just Horncastle being ridiculous. It's called a TIFO.
We see the fan displays celebrating Isak.
Choreografia.
The embrace of him. And then he's sort of rejecting that and being sold, or possibly being sold, in exactly the same way that Beardsley, Waddle and Gascoigne were sold.
Yeah, it's very much kind of your love isn't enough to keep him there. Like, your love means nothing to him because it's just a transaction. I think there was a mad line in one of the pieces. A lot of the coverage, the whole coverage of the Isak situation, I think, has been fascinating because it's really broken down on tribal lines, and you really see, like, Liverpool fans and Newcastle fans must believe completely different versions of reality. And there is clearly in the middle of the Isak thing, there is one key piece of information that none of us have, which is who said what to whatever member of Alexander Isak's camp about what was allowed to, what was kind of permitted to happen this summer. And we don't know that, and until we do, and that is kind of agreed upon by everybody, then there'll be kind of that mystery. But I think a lot of the coverage has been, like, what's the word? Like, unconstructively swayed by which club you cover, not necessarily which club you support, but which club you cover. And I think that is maybe a separate subject. There was one mad line, which was that Newcastle knew they would have to sell players in the course of their growth, but they didn't think it would be Isak. And you'd be like, what? You didn't think someone would want your best player? You thought teams would come along and be like, can we have your 4th best guy? Like, that's not going to happen. If the bigger clubs than you are going to come, they're going to come for Isak, Bruno and Tonali. They're the 3. Maybe Gordon. They're not going to be like, oh, we want to give you lots of money for Fabian Schär, and you can rebuild your squad on that. But I think where they find themselves now, and the other thing to say, we kind of mentioned this before we started recording, that it looks an awful lot like Isak has pricked Saudi pride, and that he will now be kept at Newcastle because the Saudis don't want to lose face, effectively. I think that is, and maybe that's true of the Reuben brothers as well, but certainly PIF are in a position where they look like they won't want to look like they're being bullied by a player, basically. But it's also a really bad look for Newcastle, and it's a problem that Spurs have had, Jack, I think, and certainly Everton in recent years, which is they misunderstand, or they have at times misunderstood, that to most players, they are not a destination. And you have to accept, and this is where Brighton have done really well, it's where Bournemouth have done well, it's where Brentford have done well, they have to accept that they are a stepping stone for these players, and the benefit you get is that you get the players, to be honest, ideally you get the players at their peak, at their very best, as they've got something to prove. So it might well be that, like, Newcastle end up, if he does go, having had the 2 best years of Alexander Isak. He may not be as good for Liverpool as he has been for Newcastle. That's what you have to do at this stage in your development, because it's not, I don't think it's just Real. I think Man City are apex predators. I think you can make a case that in 99% of the time United are, and to an extent Chelsea. But yeah, everybody else is subject to predators. And Newcastle seem to have thought that just because they have a lot of money in the bank, or their owners do, that rule doesn't apply. And that will make other players very reluctant, I think, to sign for them. Because it looks an awful lot like now, if you sign for Newcastle, that might be your lot.
I think that's a really, really important point about knowing your place in the food chain. Like, it's very, and you're right. This is really the story of Tottenham over the last 10 years as well. Pochettino's vision at Tottenham was for them to be more of a Atletico Madrid type model, where the manager, you have an all-powerful manager who sells half the team every 2 or 3 every year. You have a constant rolling flow of players in and out, which keeps everybody hungry and sharp. Whereas I think Daniel Levy's view was more, we're a big club and we don't sell players. And obviously the problem with that is you have a brilliant team in, Pochettino's Tottenham team were fantastic, but they didn't get enough people out, they didn't get enough people in, and eventually it goes stale, and then you're left with a bunch of players who are difficult to sell. I think even now, sort of almost 6 years on from Pochettino's departure, they're still picking up the pieces a bit. And I think with Newcastle, it's very clear, and this has been apparent for a long time, but you two have really re-emphasised it, is that I almost think they're trying too hard to be Manchester City, right? Like they think that they can occupy City's place in the market, but of course they can't, because there's all sorts of reasons, not least PSR, which we took, which we covered in the last episode. But City, the position that City are in, where they've never really been pushed around for a player ever. Like players have chosen not to join them, but there's never been a City player who who somebody has come over the top and taken out of City. But Newcastle just aren't in that position, and I think it's almost like thinking rationally, you almost wonder whether an acceptance of their place in the food chain would have allowed them to find a solution to this problem, which could have kept everybody a bit happier.
I don't remember if I've said this on Libero already or not, but I think that there is very much a case to be made that the sensible thing to do for Newcastle to do this summer was always to sell Isak. That if someone gives you, and I don't want to kind of relitigate PSR, just John, Tarek and Midel covered that beautifully earlier in the week. But like PSR is weighted so that if you make a big sale, that gives you effectively like an unlimited amount of money. It's like a free hit. Just you get to book all of that money, 150 million quid or 125 million quid, whatever, split the difference in one summer. And then if you don't sign a £60 million player on a 5-year contract, that's only £12 million. That is all you book in your PSR value. So the key to the system, and Chelsea have realised this, is that it's a cash flow game. So you go and make that one big sale and you can completely retool your squad. And Newcastle seem to have decided not to do that, basically out of pride. And I find that slightly odd, but I wonder if it's to do with, and I think what Jonathan said about kind of the role that the clubs that clubs play in the big post-industrial northern cities, especially one club cities, I think that is probably even more pronounced. That there is an element of, it feels like a grievous civic wound, and they're not really prepared to do it. And there has been this will get me a load of shit, and I don't mean it in a bad way. There's been a little bit of naivety, I think, about the way Newcastle's fans have responded to it. That a lack of realisation that this is the way that, like we said, that pretty much every club in the world has to operate. It doesn't matter who your owners are, because your owners are not Real Madrid. That's the only thing, or you're not the biggest club in the country yet. Your position in the food chain can change. But City were not at the top of the food chain 10 years ago. They are now. It can change, but it takes time, and to do that, you have to build through. You kind of have to build through the stages. And I suppose that one of the fundamental arguments about PSR is that to some fans there's an idea that they shouldn't have to build through the stages. That it should be kind of instantaneous. But that's only ever happened once, and that was with Chelsea. It didn't even happen with City. City went through the phases. Jack is looking skeptical.
I think, well, they did, but I think they went through the phases in a very accelerated way, which Newcastle were not able to do. So City, 1 year after the takeover, they were buying really good Premier League players like Tevez and Barry. 2 years after the takeover, they were buying Yaya Toure and David Silva. 3 years after the takeover, they bought Sergio Aguero, and then they won the league. And I think that where I have sympathy with Newcastle, a degree of sympathy with Newcastle fans, is that it would be easy to assume that would be Newcastle's path, and clearly it hasn't been. It's been a lot slower, and obviously City got to skip the step where they had to sell Aguero. Like Aguero left after 9 years. Like they never had an Isak situation with Aguero.
Just one thing on that though is that City paid Aguero like the player that the wages that City paid Aguero matched their valuation of the player, and I think Isak, central to his complaint, appears to be, if you think I'm worth 150 million, you should pay me like a 150 million pound player, and I think that is a bad look, but it's also a really that is a coherent view of the situation.
It completely is. I mean, if you Liverpool are not going to be offering Isak 145 grand a week, are they? They're going to be offering him a number starting with a 2.
Maybe even a 3.
Maybe even a 3. So he's looking to pretty much double his wages because that's what the market value is. Now, I understand if Newcastle feel they can't afford that, but that's where they need coherent planning at the club. And maybe even somebody began to do this, but somebody needed, when it became apparent this was going to be an issue in the spring, to say to him, look, either we're going to have to get rid of you, or how about we give you a new contract, we'll bump up your wages by whatever we can afford, 30 grand, 40 grand a week, with a clause in, something can come and get you for 120 million, or whatever figure they negotiate at the end of next season. That then gives them a year to bring people in, rather than this scrabble that they might have now for 11 days to bring somebody. It's however badly you feel Isak has behaved, Newcastle have handled it incredibly badly as well.
And this is the other point of difference between Manchester City and Newcastle United, right? Is that 4 years after Abu Dhabi bought Manchester City, they had Ferran Soriano and Cheeky Brigistan installed. And then another 3 years after that, they were able to get their mate Guardiola in charge. Whereas Newcastle Newcastle have been going through this summer window without a chief executive or without a director of football.
They do have Eddie Howe's nephew, though. So I wonder who Eddie Howe's nephew thinks the manager of Newcastle United should be.
The other thing, Jack, Dan, I think we've got sort of bogged down in the transferiness of Isak. But you are right that City's progress through the kind of food chain was massively accelerated because that was football's like Wild West period. Football was slow to respond to the changing nature of, again, as Tarek and Miguel and John talked about, like the changing nature of ownership. It's odd to me that Newcastle haven't recognised that all you have to do in a PSR world is sell one player. Just sell one player for a lot of money. And I, as a Liverpool fan, I don't particularly want Liverpool to be paying British record fees for players. It feels a bit weird to me. And I'm not convinced Isak is worth the amount of money they're going to commit to him. It's not like I'm desperate to see Alexander Isak playing for Liverpool. My nature of fandom is I'd rather they go and sign someone I've only vaguely heard of and they turn out to be amazing. That's what I like about football. I like it when Liverpool feel like that. But from Newcastle's point of view, £25 million transforms their expectations because they have everything in place this summer. You have Champions League football, and if you had that money right at the start of the summer, you'd have this massive... You can times it by 5, effectively, in terms of what it's worth in PSR. Newcastle's PSR problems, like Aston Villa's, entirely of their own making. The whole debate is framed around the fact that they're not allowed to spend. They've both spent more than basically every other club on the planet, apart from half a dozen in the last 5 or 6 years. This is your chance to break even. That's what you have to do, and it's the way the game works. And to be honest, it's better than... It's not entirely fair, but if you are set up properly with the proper hierarchy, the proper executive structure, you can use this to your advantage. And I find it odd that there doesn't seem to be any recognition within Newcastle that this is an opportunity as much as it is a blow.
Yeah, I mean, this is completely the thing with the way PSR works. As far as I understand it, and if accountants want to write in and tell me I've got it wrong, fair enough. But Newcastle spent around about 60 million on Isak over a 5-year deal. They've had 2 years of those. So if they sell him for, say, 120 million, that means the book profit is 100 million, which, as Rory says, if you then sign a load of players on 5-year deals, is 500 million. Now, the idea that, PSR's restricted us, well, hang on, there's £500 million to spend. Yeah, okay, you lose a very good forward, but you get 2 forwards who might be that good, and 3 midfielders and 3 defenders, and still have some change left over. The idea that PSR is restricted, it's the refusal to sell one player, to sort of so distrust their recruitment process that they sort of think, oh, hang on, if we had 500 million to spend, we just get hopeless players. We need to stick with the one we know is good. It's a real sort of admission of a lack of confidence in their own structures.
Coming up after the break, we will reintroduce Jonathan Wilson to the concept of an Instagram story. I think if the 2010s were the decade of the screenshotted iPhone note posted on Twitter for a player to ask to leave the club, I feel like last night made clear what we've been thinking for a long time, which is that the 2020s is the decade of the Instagram story player statement. This is what we saw from Isak yesterday. It's a big escalate. It was clearly a big escalation because it led to the Newcastle statement. Jonathan, you're a man in love with Instagram stories. What were you happy to see? Were you happy to see your favourite medium take over the football landscape?
No, I think they should send letters. I think they should type it out. They should put it in an envelope and put a stamp on it. Lick the envelope shut. Maybe put some sellotape on the back. Ideally, possibly a wax seal. And then probably send it by horse, on a messenger on a horse to deliver it to the club chairman. I mean, what I don't understand is, I don't understand why nobody puts in transfer requests anymore. And then the more I think about it, the more I don't understand why anybody ever put in transfer requests. What was the point of them? Like, it just seems to have, in my understanding, this isn't the first time Newcastle have had a want-away player who's gone on strike. George Easton famously did it. And it led to significant changes in the transfer system. I mean, by the time it got through the courts in 1963, but it was 1960. He'd been there for 4 years. He decided he wanted to move to London. I said, no, you can't go. His contract was up, but he wasn't allowed to leave under the transfer system as it then was. So he moved to Guildford and became a cork salesman for a few months before Newcastle went, actually, this is pointless. We'll have the £47,500 that Arsenal are offering. But Easton then took him to court as well to try and get back wages, and it was the transfer system was ruled as it wasn't actually ruled illegal. It was ruled as ultra vires, which is a term I'd only come across this morning, but it means sort of beyond the power of employers to enforce.
Yeah, reaching beyond its means. Yeah.
So, as I understand it, if a player put in a transfer request in those days, it meant the club didn't have to pay him anymore. But equally, it was the only way he could sort of free himself from the expectation he'd turn up for training. But I don't understand. What was Pascal Chimbonda doing with a transfer request in his sock? He didn't need to. He could have just gone and got a phone and put out an Instagram story. He could have done it during the game. Like, didn't have to even wait till the end. So yeah, I don't. What was a transfer request ever for? Why did we have this obsession with? He has filed a transfer request.
But do you not think that this is? I think this is fascinating. Is that it kind of illustrates that so much of football is based. It exists in this like non-legal territory, but because of the weird world of football, it kind of has an enforceable, almost like common law quality. So even the transfer system itself, which is the sort of thing that I think nobody in football really wants to dig too deep into. There's been a couple of kind of court cases that have forced it kind of closer to the surface. But when you think about what a transfer is, it's quite weird. Like, it's quite weird that you get to pluck a number out of nowhere that has there is no like link between the player's contract and how much you want for another club to sign them. It's just a number you've made up.
That is the market, though, Rory. That is what a market is.
It's the invisible hand of the market. But at the same time, the invisible hand of the market isn't meant to be like just some guy, and it's always a guy, or normally a guy, like plucking a figure from thin air. Be like, oh, well, he's worth 200 million. And you're like, well, is it? I mean, it's maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a type of...
Isn't that how the market sets the price of milk?
By massively overpricing it.
But look at like a gold ring or something. Like milk, you kind of, to an extent, you do need. Like a gold ring, somebody's willing to pay $3,000, so it's worth $3,000.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, right. That's fair enough. That anything, any kind of commodity or any resource is only worth whatever anyone's prepared to pay for it. I get that. But there is still the fact that it's not like the transfer values that we put on players are not. They're completely kind of subjective, and then there are all these stages in that are reliant entirely on kind of we seem to accept them as being real things. I mean, the term you used, Jack, I think before was gentleman's agreement, right? And I mean, what's a gentleman's agreement? I don't know what a gentleman's agreement. I've never made a gentleman's agreement with anybody.
I think this is a really interesting point, right? Because gentleman's agreement. I mean, I don't really know what a transfer request is, but I think a transfer request and a gentleman's agreement, they're both kind of ultimately they're non-legal, right? They're not a contract, and they're not legally enforceable, and they only carry as much weight as you would want, as as people will happily invest in them, but they won't stand up in court. And I think this is, I mean, clearly it's apparent from Isak's, we can quibble about whether or not he's put in a transfer request, but it's clear from his Instagram story that what he believes that a gentleman's agreement was made and broken. And in that sense, it reminds me very much of the situation of Harry Kane in 2021, right? Like, so City were interested in Kane in the summer of 2020. Kane was interested in going, and Kane believed that he had a gentleman's agreement with Daniel Levy that he could go next time a big team came in for him for big money. And so in the summer of 2021, he thought, well, here we are. City bid for him, but I believe that they offered 75 plus 25 for Kane, which didn't come close to Daniel Levy's valuation. Levy thought, well, gentleman's agreement or not, unless they're going to pay 150 plus million, I'm not going to sell Kane, my best player. And so it actually, in that way, and Kane came back late for the start of pre-season training. And clearly, and what became apparent, I think, over the course of the summer, and this is where it really ties back into Isak, was firstly that it felt like the buying club were leaving the player a little bit abandoned. They were leaving him to happy for him to hang out to dry a little bit and see how the situation played out, which I think was certainly true of City, who didn't really want Kane that much. And I think that may well turn out to be the case with Liverpool and Isak as well, depending on what Liverpool do next. But the second thing that I think was very clear in both the case of Kane 2021, Isak now, and Rory touched on this earlier, is that whether they show up for training or not, the player doesn't have much power. It's very easy for people to get very angry about player power. But when I look at the situation here, what's really striking to me is it's not power, it's the absence of power. It's the absence of power, which is why you don't show up for training for a bit, or you train with Real Sociedad, or you do like a sad Instagram story post about how much you want to leave. If Isak really had power, he'd have been playing at Anfield last weekend. And if Kane really had power in the summer of 2021, he would have gone to City and scored 1 million goals for City. But instead, he had to do another 2 years at Tottenham before his contract only had 1 year left and they sold him to Bayern Munich. So I do think that we have to be aware of that dynamic, which I think gets a little bit lost.
Yeah, but I think that's sort of built in, is necessary. You can't have players just, the week before cup final, I want to go and play for that team in the cup final. You have to have these restrictions. Football is not the only career, not the only profession where there are restrictions on when you can resign and move jobs. I'm pretty sure in teaching you're not allowed to resign mid-term. I think there's other careers as well that when you sign up to it, and footballers are incredibly well remunerated for it, one of the things is you submit to this process. So I sort of think the trade-off there, they get an incredibly good lifestyle, incredible amounts of money, but part of the sort of part of the payment for that is, well, you are going to be restricted in whatever movement you have. At the same time, I get very sort of, Cristiano Ronaldo talking about players as slaves. There's something obscene about the use of that word, because at any time he wants, Alexander Isak or Cristiano Ronaldo or anybody can say, actually, that's it. I'm retiring. I'm out. I'm going to go and become a cork salesman in Guildford, or do what Wilf Mannion did when he went on strike and sell chicken coops around Middlesbrough. He's welcome to do that. He's not a slave. He can leave that job. He just can't move to another club within that profession.
But it is interesting, that tension, I think, between, and that's kind of what, maybe that'll be the long-term legacy of Isak, that there is always in every sport like a battle between the wills of the owners and the executive class and the players. Just the players are effectively employees, and it is in the interest of capital to reduce kind of the options available to those employees as much as possible. And I think football is susceptible to that, just like any industry. Isak clearly thought he had an agreement, and he has done all he can to make sure that agreement is honoured. And you've seen that this gradual ratcheting up of pressure, haven't you, over the course of the summer? So initially it was kind of not going on tour, which is the sort of thing that a manager can say is a minor groin strain. And then it was training on his own at Sociedad, which was a bit weird, but nobody really said anything about it. It was weird that he was training at another club. I'm not sure that happens that often, to be perfectly honest. And then it was refusing to train or not being allowed to train at the same time as his teammates. Then it was being banned from the barbecue, which was the point when we all knew it was kind of beyond repair. And now he's put out a statement. I think the reason he's not put in a transfer request is because I think a transfer request costs him money. I think it invalidates certain elements of loyalty bonuses or whatever, but also I think Jan-Arda Fjortoft, your guest on It Was What It Was, Wilson, made this point on Twitter the other day that the signing bonus you get for signing a contract is paid in instalments over the course of your contract. And it may be that some of those are linked to Isak not putting in a formal transfer request. So I think the statement that he put on Instagram will have been worded so it does not count as a transfer request. I think, not certain, but I suspect a formal transfer request has to include the words "I request a transfer" or something very close to it to be kind of recognisable. The fact that it's all convention, Jack, means that God knows what any of this stuff means. I don't know whether any of it has any meaning whatsoever. But it is it has increasingly taken on the timber of a player kind of scratching and clawing and grasping at any scrap of influence he might be able to have with the club, because the player's interests and the club's interests are totally divergent at this point. And that's always an issue. But I wonder now whether more players of that level will start to take measures to sort of swing the balance in their favour. Because the main issue that Isak's got is he signed a 6-year contract.
Yeah.
He shouldn't have signed a 6-year contract.
I think that's a really important point, and one that can't be forgotten if we're. I mean, it's very. I mean, I know I said a minute ago that Isak doesn't have any power, but I mean, and that is true, to an extent. The limitation, like his power, is severely limited by the 6-year deal that he signed in 2022. I mean, to bring it back to Kane signed a 6-year deal at Tottenham in 2018, and that meant that when he was only 3 years into this when he decided he wanted to go to City, and of course Daniel Levy could say, well, you've got 3 years left.
Well, so this is the point where I suppose a player's power fluctuates, doesn't it? So the player at the point of signing, whether it's for a new club or on a new contract, has quite a lot of power all of a sudden. That power kind of depreciates as soon as you take them out of the showroom. Do you know what I mean? As soon as they are kind of in that contract, they have given all of that power to the club. And I suppose the lesson of both Isak and Kane should be, don't sign long-term deals. I'm really surprised that players still sign deals more than like 4 years. I guess I know that they want the security and they want the kind of, just a player can get injured any minute and that can be that. So the instinct, certainly when they're young, is to sign the longest deal possible because it guarantees them their lifelong earnings. Effectively, it's generational wealth that you're acquiring. But I'm surprised that when Isak went to Newcastle, he accepted a 6-year deal. If his long-term ambition was not to play for Newcastle, that should very much have been his agent, who I think is Vlado Lemic, saying, well, you know, we want 3, and Newcastle saying we want 6, and maybe you do a deal at 4 or 5 or whatever. To sign for 6 it seems self-defeating. And the other thing that players will do, and we've seen this elsewhere in the Premier League this summer, we are already in a state where release clauses are far more common in England than they used to be. It was not standard for players to have release clauses, even like time-limited release clauses in England. 5 years ago, that wasn't normal. And I think now, increasingly, it seems like everyone is signing deals with release clauses in them, even if sometimes Nottingham Forest decide that they're actually not there at all.
So I think Forest. So this is in the case of Morgan Gibbs-White, which I think is worth bringing up here because it shows again that player power is not. But it shows that players are not as powerful as you might think, right? Like Gibbs-White had a clause in his contract. Tottenham made 2 offers. It felt at that point as if the clause had been met. But I think the second offer was certainly in excess of the 60 million clause. Gibbs-White wanted to go, I think, was heading down to Tottenham for a medical, and then Nottingham Forest decided, actually, in our view, the clause was not met, and he never joined Tottenham, and then he ended up signing a new contract at Nottingham Forest. I think that shows that even a clause is not an automatic get out for a player. And
really, what's odd there is that it was a secret clause, and I don't really know what that means.
Yeah, I mean it is really weird. Why have a clause there if it's secret? I mean, the Gibbs-White story is really odd that he didn't feel empowered to push that through if that was what he really wanted. What has he been offered? What's he been promised? Maybe he goes next summer and there has some sort of secret deal has been done there. But it's I find that really odd that Gibbs-White didn't feel empowered to push that through. And I guess the power that Forest had was the suggestion that somehow Spurs had access to knowledge of his secret deal that they shouldn't have had, that there'd been some breach there.
It does make sense, to be fair, to have that I wonder, it feels kind of as though Forest have kind of changed the rules a little bit on Gibbs-White, and yet it's interesting that he's not kicked up a fuss. What I have been told, and this is single sourced, so I have no idea whether it's true, is that there is some intimation that he might join Man City next summer, and that for that deal to go through, it's obviously easier for him to still be at Forest. So that might have softened the blow of him not getting the Spurs move. We will see if that kind of comes out. But we might as well say it here. It's a safe space. I'm not saying it's guaranteed. It's just what I've heard. But I do wonder whether it's actually quite a good idea, for a player and a club to say, we will put this figure in your contract, but God knows how. Again, this is convention rather than legal status. Like how you enforce it, I don't know. There is a figure in your contract, but it will not be made public. That is quite a good way, actually, of the player retaining their power without the club thinking, kind of, we're basically just saying this is a for sale price at any point. And the other one is the time limited clause. I think, did Eze have a clause until August the 15th or something? There's like, if you pay by a certain time, it is this amount of money, and after that, we get to randomly pluck a figure out of thin air.
Well, Fellaini when he went from Everton to United, that if United had bought him a couple of weeks earlier, that they got him cheaper because they'd have got within the time frame of a clause.
If I was a player basically any team who wanted to leave where I was, and I watched the events of this summer, and I'd seen Gibbs-White with a clause, with a bid coming in over the clause, and then for Gibbs-White not to be able to make the move to Tottenham, I would be worried at that point about my own ability to get out of my club. And then if I watched Isak behaving the way that he's behaved at Newcastle, I would think, well, why wouldn't you? Like, surely in the context of Gibbs-White, it's more understandable why a player would just play every card. And it made me realise that I think the only real leverage that a player can ever have is a ticking contract. Mbappe is weird. Mbappe is a unique example in so many ways, right? There's only one Mbappe, and there's only really one PSG as well. But in 2022, remember when Mbappe first nearly went to Real Madrid, and then he signed a 2-year extension with a possible optional third year, which was never triggered. He tried to force his way to Real Madrid, but he knew ultimately that he would be able to get there because he signed a short-term deal. And to Rory's point earlier, it does make you think why players sign these long-term deals, but given how hard it is to get out of a good team, surely the direction of travel, if you really, really want control over your career above everything else, and if you're confident in your earning potential, and you're hopeful that you won't just do your ACL when you're a free agent, surely at that point the only way to get leverage is with a short-term deal.
Yeah, no, I'm surprised that there haven't been more players who've taken that route, just because the amount of money that they're earning anyway is generational. What's 150 grand a week? It's like 7.5 million a year over 3 years. That's still 21 million pounds, plus whatever Isak will have earned at Sociedad and Dortmund before that. He's still a rich man. All right, if you lose half of it to tax, I suppose, but you're still a lot of money. And it strikes me as odd that he's so worried by the prospect of what might happen at the end of those 3 years that he's prepared to commit another 3, not just another 1, but another 3. There will be very few players around who have any issue at all with what Isak's done. I don't think his teammates will think it's bad. I don't think any of his peers will think it's bad. I don't think if he does sign for Liverpool that he'll walk into the dressing room and Virgil van Dijk will be like, oh God, Alexander, you pushed your luck a bit there, didn't you? The players will know you are doing whatever you can to get what you want. And the players don't have to look very far. We've talked about this already. They don't have to look very far to see the flip side. You speak to any player about this in an unguarded moment, and they will tell you that clubs will screw you as soon as look at you if they need to. They will put you in a bomb squad. I mean, even the concept of a bomb squad is disgraceful when you think about it. It's saying, well, we don't want you to... Can you imagine if the Athletic put you in a bomb squad, Jack? That it would... I mean, the Observer can't do it to me, there's only 4 of us, but like, in most industries, there is not a chance you'd be told, well, look, we just don't want you to work here anymore. So we're not going to kind of pay you up and give you all the money in your contract so you can leave. We're just going to kind of actively restrict you doing what you want to do. That doesn't happen. If you look at, like, as I say, I wrote about this the other day, and Calvin Phillips is quite a good example. Calvin Phillips has never done anything other than intimate that he wants to play for Manchester City. And Manchester City have made it very clear they do not want Calvin Phillips around. So now he is training, apparently, with a group of players who are also going out on loan this season. How many players are in that group? I don't know. But he's had his squad number taken off him. They've made it really clear he is not welcome at Manchester City. And I have a lot of sympathy for Calvin Phillips, just we share a plasterer. And I feel bad. Calvin Phillips is a lovely guy. Whether he's good enough to play for City is a different matter. But they did pay a lot of money for him. They took him away from a Leeds team who needed him, and then kind of wasted his talent. And City have basically treated Calvin Phillips pretty poorly. And players know each other, players talk, players know the kind of the industry they work in. Very few players will be looking at Isak and thinking, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. They'll be thinking, I'd do that if I was in that situation. And some of them will be thinking, I might think twice before signing for Newcastle.
Yeah, I mean, the PFA have tried to sort of prevent or at least ameliorate bomb squads when they happen. So I think the regulation is there has to be at least 5 of you in the group. The idea is you can't actually train alone, that you will have at least 4 other people to train with. I mean, it's obviously not great training when there's only 5 of you. It doesn't feel like the PFA have really sort of pushed that as hard as they might. But I think Rory's absolutely right. If players are ruthless with clubs, well, clubs kind of started by being ruthless with them, and as soon as you cease to be used to them, they will be incredibly cold to you. So, I would not have handled this as Isak has, but equally, I sort of grasp some of the motivation for it.
Yeah. I think that if there's one question I want to leave people with at the end of this episode is, who would be in the Libero bomb squad? Would it be Miguel? I think it would be. I can see Miguel and Horncastle having to come to Libero Towers after everybody else already left and podcast by themselves.
I mean, to be fair, Miguel kind of does that because of how busy his schedule is anyway. So
trying to organise Miguel to do anything is like, is there any week of the year that Miguel does not describe as a nightmare? I'm not sure there is.
Well, we'll be if we can find the time, we will be back at the start again of next week. Thank you very much to everyone for listening in. Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, producer Tom. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and so on. And we'll be back next week.